And today I'm going to talk about the story of two transitions in what used to be called the Arab Spring. Egypt and Libya present two stories of failed transitions, and despite the different trajectory of the two revolutions, both countries failed, at least so far, to fulfill the promises of a new era. I focus my discussion on elite choices of alliance and realliance building and how it affects the transitional path. And here I distinguish between two kinds of elites. State elite, what I call the state elite, those with vested interests in the political and social order established by the old regime, and the dissident or counter elite that try or seek to establish themselves in the new regime. I argue that the nature of the old regime and the perception of threat and opportunity affects or mediates these changes, and I think this brings the whole issue of structure and agency to the discussion. I call the regime coalition or the state elite coalition attempt to maintain the unity of the dominant classes and molding its various factions together. I call this the state's dilemma. And as for the dissident dilemma, it also refers to the collective action problem of the counter elite in maintaining its coalition and its oppositional alliances. The interaction between these two dilemmas affects the transition to democracy or the democratic transition. So in this way, I raise two main questions, which are what account for the formation and dissolution of revolutionary coalitions, and how do the main social and political actors change alliance and why. And I tackle these dilemmas or discuss these questions and dilemmas through three main milestones or three main stops along the transitional path in the two countries. What I call the situation during and immediately after the revolution, the elections, and the politics of inclusion and exclusion. If we look at the situation in Egypt during and immediately after the revolution, we find that the negative coalitions that overthrew Mubarak consisted of the youth movements, the Muslim Brotherhood, the secular elites, individual Salafists. They were not yet materialized in organizational entity, and individual Copts as well, because the church itself was against the dissent. They all shared antagonism towards Mubarak's police regime and his plans to install his son as his successor. If we look at the side of the the regime coalition, which comprise of the police, the army, the state institutions, the National Democratic Party members, and the businessmen or the businessmen crony affiliated or in coalition with Gamal Mubarak. What we now know is that the revolution took place at a moment where there was an interdivision in the regime's coalition. We know that the military was against the hereditary scenario, and most probably it perceived the revolution as an opportunity to put an end to this scenario. And this interdivision within the regime's coalition explains why immediately after Mubarak stepped down, the deep state, what we call the deep state, kept a low profile. So, because after all it was under attack. The police capabilities faltered in front of the angry crowds. The ruling party headquarters were burned down, ushering its political demise. Gamal Mubarak business elite was wanted, but this was not a surrender. especially if we put in mind that the military perception of the new social and political regime was to keep Mubarakism without Mubarak in power. If we look at Libya, and I just go quickly over this period because I think the election and the politics of the exclusion and inclusion is more important. If we look for Libya, we see that the negative coalition was comprised of a wide array of groups and actors. They all share the anti-Qaddafi sentiments. We see the experienced politician who established the National Transitional Council, the Islamist groups, the brigades that joined in during the war, anti-Qaddafi tribes and their militias, and the Eastern Federalists. And as you can see, the coalition was too broad and contradictory actually to survive. And the first signs of this division or its division was the perception of who the pro-Qaddafi forces were and what their interests were about. We'll move to the next stop, which is the elections. The first elections that followed the overthrow of the two regimes in Egypt and Libya were the first step in shaking and actually later cracking the negative coalition. If we look at Egypt, we find that the lack of the transitional plan led the SCAF to be in charge of the transitional period, aware, of course, of its vested interest and aiming at retaining order in the streets. The SCAF, which is the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, opened channels with Islamists, perceiving them the most organized civil groups that could control the masses. The army also saw the election first trajectory as a means to contain dissent and override the myriad of interests represented in Al-Tahrir. On their part, of course, Islamists were confident of their organizational capabilities and electoral experience, and they were fearing the comeback of Mubarak's allies, so they pushed for the election first trajectory. Probably they were also worried of the army's presence in the political scene, but they lacked the revolutionary agenda to clash with it. Concerning the revolutionaries and the secular elite, they perceived the election first trajectory as an attempt to exclude them or marginalize their role in the new political landscape. For them, the congruence between the Islamists and the army's view was a deal, according to which the army guarantees the political rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, and in return the latter would guarantee the main interest of the army and keep its leaders unaccountable. A demarcation was thus the election put a demarcation between hardline revolutionaries represented mainly in the youth movements allying with civil forces and moderate revolutionaries represented in the Islamists. So the first elections was thus the first rift in this coalition, Islamist versus the rest within the negative coalition, not the rest of the country. A rift that got deeper with every electoral event. The more electoral gains for the Islamists, the more they distance themselves from the other civil constituencies, leaning more towards the more conservative circles. On the contrary, the more electoral loss the civil, the youth movements endured, the more they intensified their radical approach and became more alienated from the army and the rest of the society who were in favor of stability. For secular elites, the more electoral loss they experienced, the more they became convinced of the impossibility of reaching power through the ballot box, and the more they got worried about their influence in post-revolutionary regime. The presidential election was another major manifestation of the fragility of the negative coalition, but it was more important, it was the moment in which the counter-revolution coalition or the states coalition put itself back together and started to strike back. In Libya, if we look at the situation in Libya and what the election did, it was also a demarcating moment between the hardline versus the moderate or centrist revolutionaries. But contrary to Egypt, in Libya, Islamists were the hardliners, while the more liberal were the moderates. The hardline coalition consisted of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafist brigades from revolutionary strongholds like Misrata, Islamist brigades and Federalists from the east. The moderates were those with vested political and economic interests in the Libyan state, as politicians and bureaucrats united in the National Transitional Council, who later became the national, they gathered themselves in the National Forces Alliance, and the tribal brigades that were favored under Qaddafi regime, but changed sides in the early days of the revolution, such as Zintan. Despite the different agendas, the hardliners perceived the undermining of vested interest as the most dangerous threat to the revolution that deserves unity. And this is, of course, related to the legacy of the old regime and its reliance on patronage network, which produced all this competition and rivalry among regions, towns, and actors and tribes. The National Forces Alliance's dominance or electoral dominance in the parliament was soon challenged by the pattern of shifting alliance of independent members. The rivalry between these two camps reached its climax during the passing of the law on political isolation, and I'll talk about this in a minute. We see in both Libya and Egypt, the states and the dissidents coalition were trying to solve their own dilemmas by trying to maintain and broaden their alliances. They were also trying to overcome they were trying to establish a certain social and political order. The state's dilemma was how to restore the pre-January, in Egypt, for example, the state's dilemma was how to restore the pre-January 25 regime and contain dissent in the streets. But the dissidents' dilemma was how to establish a new regime that differs from the old one. And what was the nature of this regime? In Libya, the centrist coalition wanted a political and social order that somehow protect the vested interest created by the old regime, but the hardliner wanted an order that makes a total break with the past. Moving to the politics of inclusion and exclusion. This summarizes the situation in Egypt, particularly in June 30s and beyond. After the elections, the election of Morsi as a president, his grab of power from the SCAF was apparently not part of the deal. And his attempt to trim the nails of Mubarak remnants in the judiciary highly alerted the deep state coalition, solidifying its plan to overthrow him. The deep state perceived Morsi's move as an introduction to exclude them from the post-Mubarak regime. The coalition was, however, aware that any claims of authority had to emanate from the street. It's clear now that the aim was not only overthrowing Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, but impeding any future dissent by tarnishing the most organized ally in any possible future negative coalition. Of course, Morsi's disastrous performance and his failure to meet his pre-elections promises facilitated the mission of the old regime coalition. Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood knew that they were fighting the deep state, but instead of unifying forces and approaches in dealing with it as a one entity, they diversified their strategies from open hostility to one of cooptation. They didn't spare any effort to lose every probable ally in their coalition. They perceived every move as a threat and a part of conspiracy against them, and such a perception led to their exclusion of everyone from the decision-making process. Media messages, the boiling street protests, the judiciary rulings were all for them, for the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi, an evidence that plots were made. It's true that part of this perception was true, but the way Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood dealt with this was disastrous and increasingly alienated them not only from the other political forces, but from the rest of the society, and paved the way for their suppression. On their part, the revolutionary youth movements felt entitled to impose their views given their role in the revolution and in return for their support in the presidential elections. Their more radical approach clashed with the non-confrontational strategy of the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in dealing with the police and the army. The slower the steps taken by Morsi to dismantle the interests and corrupt networks of the Mubarak's regime, the more antagonized the youth movements became. And this was particularly the case with the demands to restructure the Ministry of Interior. The latter share of power provoked the secular forces. They were also challenged by the new Islamist elites and worried about their social status. Morsi's November constitutional declaration, where he grabbed judicial and executive powers, followed by Ittihadiyya events where members of the Muslim Brotherhood attacked the encampers in front of the Ittihadiyya palace, all ushered an irreconcilable rift between the Muslim Brotherhood and the revolutionary youth movement. It was also an open invitation for the deep state elite to broaden its coalition. And this is when the National Salvation Front was established, an alliance between among liberals, Nasrites, leftists, and some remnants of the old regime. The army apparently welcomed the invitation on part of this new alliance, either because it was planning to seize power again or because it perceived this as an opportunity to redeem much of its lost popularity and status that was relatively hurt under the SCAF, and overcome the dilemma of establishing the desired social and political order that obviously the Muslim Brotherhood failed to establish. This was the scene of the July 3rd, and of course what happened, or what we ended up with, is the deep state has actually reasserted itself and protected its interest, and this was reflected in the 2014 constitution, which instead of establishing a full-fledged state institutions, the constitution reflected a more five dumb entities that all adamant in protecting its stakes. With the election of the last election, presidential elections, the old layout of the Egyptian system became clear. The military on top, state institution and bureaucracy, and Mubarak's business elite, and anyone else is just playing next. In Libya, the law on political isolation was another incident of deepening the rift between the moderate and hardliners. The hardliners formed a coalition based on animosity to Qaddafi's elite. Among the same coalition, different motives were employed. The two main Islamic currents in the General National Council, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists, despite their ideological differences and competition, but they shared the same aim of attaining political dominance over the National Forces Alliance dominated government. The Justice and Construction Party, the political arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, was also able to mobilize revolutionary forces like the Federalists, despite their different, again, agendas and their distinctive constituencies. The Federalists joined because they have their historical grievances of underdevelopment that they suffered during al-Qaddafi era. The law on political isolation was perceived by the National Forces Alliance and former Qaddafi allies as a step to exclude them from the political scene. It was actually an existential threat, as many of its members have to resign their post and put an end to their political role. At the same time, former and current army officers were frustrated by the increasing influence of the militias and perceived it as a reproduction of Qaddafi's security brigades that largely marginalized them. It's known that Gaddafi kept the army ill-equipped and ill-trained compared to his loyal security brigades or revolutionary committees. To strengthen its position, the Islamist coalition ordered armed allies from Libya Shield Force to the capital. Most of its members are from Misrata, the port city. The rise of Misrata was perceived as a threat to Zintan. The feud or rivalry between Misrata and Zintan is also known, which Zintan quickly started renewing long-standing tribal alliances with other powerful Western tribes. The National Force Alliance thus realized that it has to forge new alliances to stay in the political game. After attaining the goal of undermining the National Forces Alliance, the Federalists perceived the new political agenda of the leading coalition, now the Islamists in the General National Council, as marginalization to them, and this has facilitated their coalition with the Zintan. This perception of Eastern exclusivity and the desire for a stronger military on their part put the nucleus of what is now known as the Dignity or the Operation Dignity, under the command of the retired General Khalifa Haftar, who formed a coalition of many ex-Gaddafi military officers, particularly in the east, and also was able to include powerful tribal groupings in the east, and a range of military units quickly joined his coalition or his operation. Also tribal groups in the southern city of Kofra, and the tribal armed groups from Warshfana, and on the political side, of course, he gained the support of the National Forces Alliance. Islamists in the East perceived Haftar's elastic definition of terrorism as an existential threat, and this enticed them or encouraged them to come together and to pool their forces into a coalition known as the Benghazi Revolutionary Shura Council. And the result now is that we have two campuses, the Libya Dawn operation and the Dignity operation. Libya Dawn operation, we can loosely describe it as Islamist, Misratan, anti-Zintan, anti-federalist, but it comprises, of course, it's not about Islamists versus the liberals. The situation in Libya is much more complex, and the lines of intersection between the regions and the towns are much more complicated. I'll just conclude. This is how different modes of transition or different trajectories of transition led to almost the same dilemmas, but of course with different intensity or at different degrees. Social division, polarization, security deficit plague the two experiences, and it's really interesting how each country, while observing the other's trajectory, failed to learn the lessons. Libya should have realized that at times of transition, it's just inconceivable to push the restart button of the whole political process and legitimizing and trying to eradicate political opponents cannot work, especially if they have these opponents represent substantial constituencies. As for Egypt, weakening the civil society, announcing the death actually of politics in Egypt, demonizing considerable constituency of the population, and playing the different political actors against each other, all lead to a more violent path of resistance. And this is what really going to make Egypt looks more like Libya. Thank you.